I'll be sharing today is closely related to my dissertation research, which focuses on the composition and transmission of the Janamsakhis, the earliest accounts of Guru Nanak's life. One of my primary objectives is to understand this text in its proper context. And this essay will figure into the introductory chapter of my dissertation, in which I analyze secondary scholarship on the topic of Janamsakhis. Now, of course, time is limited here, so I can't say everything that has ever been said about the Janamsakhis. So instead, we'll focus on one of the categories that scholars have used to organize and understand this particular set of texts. In a recent paper, I challenged the scholarly assumption of Janamsakhi as a unitary, stable, and unproblematic category. Among other things, I provided manuscript evidence, such as the one you see here, to illustrate the fact that the manuscripts themselves don't even use the word Janamsakhi, and that this category includes an incredibly diverse set of writings. In this paper, I will take the next logical step by interrogating the broader literary genre, hagiography, under which the Janamsakhi writings have been included. As a disclaimer, this paper does not suggest that we abandon these categories altogether, nor does it seek to offer any solutions as to how we can better classify these writings. My underlying objective is to demonstrate problems that arise in uncritically employing the genre of hagiography, and keeping the time limit in mind, I want to focus narrowly on one specific argument: the problem of reading Guru Nanak as a saint. This singular move underpins the scholarly assertion that hagiography can be translated from a specifically Christian to a specifically Sikh context. In illustrating how applying this genre disrupts our senses of history, literature, and Guru Nanak's worldview, I hope to open up a space for developing a more nuanced, refined, and constructive framework as we approach the early accounts of Guru Nanak's life. Now, before we begin evaluating the genre in relation to our understanding of Guru Nanak, let us first take a moment to understand what it actually entails. The term hagiography is derived from two Greek words, hagios, meaning holy, and graphein, meaning to write. So hagiography refers to a composition, a writing, about one who is considered to be holy, a saint. And Timothy Barnes has called attention to the specifically Christian context from which this type of writing emerges, and he dates the first known example of hagiography to the 2nd century. Scholars have detailed the rise of hagiographical writing through late antiquity, its flourishing during the Middle Ages, and the fact that it continues to be produced in the present day. As Daniel Head has pointed out, the category has become so widely broadened that it, quote, has come to refer to the full range of Christian literature which concerns the saints, end quote, and that despite its distinctively Christian origin, the genre of hagiography has been adopted by modern scholars and practitioners to apply to parallel practices in other religious traditions. Now, the adoption of hagiography in other religious traditions refers to an act of translation, in which this Christian-specific genre is generalized, stripped of its peculiarities, and transposed from one system to another. As with any act of translation, something's lost in this process. And furthermore, the translated object, in this case the genre of hagiography, it has some baggage that it comes with, and we need to attend to this. The very notion of hagiography implies the presence of a saint as a narrative subject. The word saint derives from the Latin sanctus, a cognate for the word sanctify, to consecrate, close relative of the word sacred. And since the church began appropriating and incorporating saints, the cult of the saints, more than 1,000 years ago, the term saint has referred to figures identified, beatified, and canonized by the Catholic Church through a formal process. So the point here is that the word saint derives from a specifically Christian context and has very specifically Christian undertones, meanings. So at this point, I hope you have a basic understanding of the words, the two terms we're working with here, saint and hagiography. And so now let us turn our attention to how these terms have been deployed in relation to the life of Guru Nanak. Given the distinctively Christian roots of these categories, it comes as no surprise that the first person to place Janamsakhi under the rubric of hagiography would be a Christian missionary. In his dissertation research, Hugh MacLeod undertook a search for the historical Nanak by analyzing the Janamsakhis to determine what could or could not be accepted as factual. MacLeod's framework for the Janamsakhi relied heavily on his own scholarly innovation, the Janamsakhis as a hagiography. This assumption is evident in the opening of his dissertation, in which he wrote matter-of-factly, the Janamsakhis are hagiographic accounts of the life of Guru Nanak, each consisting of a series of separate incidents or chapters, entitled Sakhis or Gosht. Given Professor MacLeod's prominence within the field, the Eurocentric and colonialist nature of the Western Academy, and the apparent utility of the term, scholars of Sikhi and its neighbors widely and uncritically have accepted and adopted MacLeod's usage of hagiography to understand early Sikh writings. Now, while I do not doubt that the category of hagiography is useful, I also believe its application gives rise to a number of important problems, and we need to be aware of these. In his volume on South Asian biographical writing, Rupert Snell highlights the problematic assumption that, quote, the writers, sectarian leaders, and other religious figures of Indian traditions belong to that awkwardly articulated category of poet saints. Snell takes on this category of poet saints, and he lays out problems with equating this artificially constructed group with the Christian notion of sainthood. I appreciate his critique, and I'd like to briefly build on it by interrogating the membership of one of these poet saints in particular, Guru Nanak. So while Hugh MacLeod was a graduate student in London, esteemed Harvard professor Wilfred Cantwell Smith published his widely influential work, The Meaning and End of Religion. Smith proposed his theory of reification, which argued that no religious prophet, including Guru Nanak, ever intended to create a new followership, and that communities have retroactively credited these figures with establishing religious communities. Quote, as I have argued elsewhere, no great religious leader has ever founded a religion, certainly not Nanak. Nanak held that God is known through righteousness and fervent faith alone. Prompted by Smith's work and following in his footsteps, scholars in the 1960s repurposed an archaic term, sant, to construct a new grouping that linked North Indian poet saints through a sense of shared teachings and worldviews. MacLeod's research leans heavily on this emergent construct of the sant, and throughout his career, he argued that the central feature that tied together these poet saints, including Guru Nanak, was the focus on interiorized religiosity and the rejection of the external world. According to MacLeod, this particular paradigm expects that the sant offers no overt encouragement to the emergence of religious institutions or formally organized communities, nor does he anticipate or allow for any external manifestations of religious devotions, such as political engagement or social service. Now, while MacLeod's portrayal coheres with what Smith anticipates about Guru Nanak, an intense mystic focused exclusively on spirituality, it does not cohere with traditional accounts of Guru Nanak. It does not gel with what we actually know about Guru Nanak's life. The problem that I'm pointing to here is that the construction of a new category, the sant, or the poet saint, is a thinly veiled attempt to generalize the Christocentric framework of sainthood and impose it on Sikh. Categorizing Guru Nanak as a sant has made it possible for scholars to think of Janamsakhis as hagiography, and as Robin Reinhardt has pointed out, this move has led scholars in South Asia to the same negative conclusions that other scholars have reached in their studies of Christian hagiography. Because understanding Janamsakhis as hagiographies relies on the classification of Guru Nanak as a sant, I want to spend the final few minutes interrogating this label with regard to 2 points in particular. A, that Guru Nanak did not intend to establish a religious community, and B, that he had little or no interest in social or political engagement. Now, while a generalist might be inclined to agree with suggestions that Guru Nanak never meant to establish a religious tradition, specialists have recently drawn from early evidence to counter this theory. Let me share a few of the basic arguments that help distinguish Guru Nanak from the notion of sainthood, and as a corollary, help distinguish Janamsakhis from the category of hagiography. To begin, Guru Nanak's institution-building efforts evidence this intentional creation of a community. For instance, his appointment of a successor, establishing a Guru Gaddi by appointing Pailena as Guru Angad, clearly illustrates Guru Nanak's sense that he had created something unique and worth preserving. Similarly, the establishment of dharamsala, community centers for worship and learning, essentially gurdwara. This indicates a concentrated effort to create a sense of belonging, spaces around which congregations could gather and transmit their shared ideologies. Scholars have also highlighted Guru Nanak's establishment of a new city, Kartarpur, in a carefully calculated move to help foster the growth of a formative community. And references to this community in Kartarpur can be found in the writings of Bhai Gurdas, which also highlight basic Sikh traditions, aspects of communal discipline, such as Vahad and Nitne. So the establishment of these distinctive practices and traditions and institutions evidence that Guru Nanak does not fit the Sant category. He clearly envisioned creating a unique community. The second assumption, that the Sants focused primarily on interior religiosity and did not engage in social or political activities, this also does not cohere with what we know about Guru Nanak. All accounts of his life demonstrate a commitment to charitable and giving, social justice, and references to his life experiences, such as his dialogues with ascetics recorded in Siddh Ghost, his ideological precepts such as Nam Dan Ishnan or Kir Karna Nam Japna Van Chakna. These further illustrate the importance he placed on participating in society. Certainly his well-documented advocacy against social hierarchies, whether it was caste inequalities or gender discrimination. These show that he was not exclusively spiritual. And furthermore, his Bani is replete with direct references and scathing critiques of the political world around him. Perhaps the most telling evidence from among his writings is a group of 4 compositions that have come to be known as Babur Bani. In this set of writings, Guru Nanak sharply admonishes Babur, the head of the state, for his inhumane treatment of civilians, and these writings demonstrate a direct engagement with the political world surrounding Guru Nanak. This evidence together clearly overturns the hypothesis that Guru Nanak was exclusively focused on spirituality. The category of Sant does not pertain to Guru Nanak. The evidence I've cited here is just the tip of the iceberg. Yet these examples alone clearly demonstrate that Guru Nanak's approach fundamentally differs from the so-called Sant construct in at least 2 basic ways. A, he clearly intended to establish his own religious community. And B, he maintained a focus on the social and political, as well as the spiritual. In trying to fit Guru Nanak into what one might expect from a poet saint, scholars have overlooked primary source evidence of his deep social and political engagement, and in doing so, have largely misconstrued his worldviews and have distorted their representations of him. This is the problem, and it brings us back to my underlying argument. Although applying the category of hagiography offers some utility in approaching the Janamsakhis, a considerable amount of violence and distortion takes place when we use this framework uncritically. Interrogating the categories of hagiography and Sant demonstrate they are not as stable and unproblematic as many scholars have assumed. While it is not necessary to abandon these altogether, it is important for us to identify and understand the problems that come along with using these terms. It is also time for us to begin challenging and going beyond categories such as these that are distorted, Christocentric, and long outdated. It is only once we deconstruct these, and once we clear this rubble, that we will have space to develop fresh and new approaches for understanding early Sikh literature from the ground up. And this is what my larger dissertation project is. Thank you.